What's happening, guys? Welcome back to the Nerd Manual. Today we're answering the question, which came first, the computer or the nerd? Here's an interesting thought. Computer nerds are fascinated with programming, hacking, and networking computers. But what did that type of person do before computers were invented? Well, there were networks and structured algorithms before there were computers, so the computer nerds of today would still have plenty of opportunities to explore their passions in the past. I'll set the mid-1940s as a starting point for computers because that's when ENIAC was switched on, although there were much earlier calculating machines, but I'll mention those in a minute. Possibly the nerdiest thing with wires and switches prior to any electronic computers was the telephone network. In the US, the Bell network started out in 1877, and the company started buying up all the smaller phone networks by the early 1900s. At one point, every telephone in the world was connected to the Bell network in some way. Think about that for a second. You have this device in your home or office that can connect you to any other similar device anywhere else in the world. Does this sound familiar? This was an awesome playground. Nerds figured out how to use their home handsets to connect to parts of the telephone network they weren't supposed to access, and from there they explored the inner workings of the whole network. Some of these nerds went on to work for the network. Others became engineers. Some were pioneers in the computer industry. For example, Steve Wozniak was one of those telephone network explorers, and he went on to co-found Apple Computers. Now, back to those calculating machines I mentioned. They existed before the 1940s, and some of them were called computers because they computed things. But the computations were limited. For instance, an entire machine might be dedicated to computing ballistics trajectories. These machines were developed, maintained, operated, and improved upon by the kinds of nerds who would probably be computer geeks if they had been born in the past 15 or so years. I like to think that the pioneering computer nerds were Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage, who were designing mechanical calculators, protocomputers, in the early 1800s. Charles Babbage was a flake, but he was a genius. He had these outstanding ideas for a machine he called the difference engine, and it could tabulate polynomial functions. He managed to get funding to build some, but then he had these even more astounding ideas for a mechanical computer that had conditional branching, loops, and built-in memory that made his original difference engine obsolete, at least in Babbage's mind. So he gave up on building the original machine in order to develop the more complicated machine, much to the government's consternation. Prior to this, you had people programming looms using paper tape or punch cards in the early 1700s. At some point back in the mists of time, we get too far away from computers to say what the computer nerds would be doing, but I'd put my money on some sort of engineering or inventing that involved connecting different inputs to get an output, which could involve broad fields such as mathematics and chemistry, or more specific occupations like railway engineering, managing electrical power transmission, or designing the Paris underground sewer system. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, guys. I hope you found this program interesting. If you've got questions, leave them down in the comments. I will see you next time.